In the quiet, lush village of Abalu, nestled deep in the heart of the African savanna, Obinna was known as a prosperous merchant. His wealth came from trading spices, textiles, and rare goods, and his home was grand, adorned with intricate carvings and elaborate decorations. But his wealth came at a high price. His first wife, Adoma, had died during childbirth. A month later, he refused to bury her, claiming her spirit would protect their unborn child. As the villagers mourned, Obinna locked Adoma's body in a wooden chest, hiding it in a secret chamber within his house. The elders warned him, urging him to follow the ancient burial customs, but Obinna dismissed their pleas, trusting in his own beliefs. The village, once thriving with abundant crops and lively gatherings, slowly began to show signs of decay. The once clear river near Obinna's house began to dry up, and the field around his home yielded fewer crops. A strange illness spread among the villagers, striking without warning, and leaving the community in fear. Some whispered that the curse of the unburied spirit had taken root. Yet, Obinna remained unaffected by the suffering of those around him, confident that his refusal to bury his wife was justified. But the land was speaking in ways no one could ignore. Obinna remarried, and his second wife, Kayameka, was a gentle and beautiful woman. She was pregnant soon after their marriage, and Obinna couldn't help but dream of a child who would carry on his legacy. However, the joy of expecting a child soon turned to sorrow when Kayameka died during childbirth, her face contorted in agony. Again, Obinna refused to bury her, convinced that his actions were protecting the unborn child. This time, he locked Kayameka's body in an old storage room beneath the house, sealing it with iron chains to prevent any disturbance. Weeks passed, and the village began to feel the weight of another tragedy. The once bountiful trees began to wither, their leaves turning brown and brittle as if the land itself had fallen ill. Obinna, however, was unfazed. His house remained a sanctuary to him, untouched by the blight outside. But the village elders, sensing that the death of another wife had angered the spirits, gathered to confront Obinna. They warned him that the land was rejecting his actions, but he refused to listen. His wealth and pride had blinded him to the suffering of those around him. As Obinna's wealth continued to grow, so did the strange illness that plagued the village. It began with the livestock, first the chickens, then the goats. They grew weak and sickly, their bodies shrinking in a matter of days. The villagers grew desperate, seeking answers from the spiritual leaders, who suggested that Obinna's refusal to bury his wives was the cause of the curse. But Obinna, now dismissing the warnings, laughed at their superstitions. He had built his empire on his own terms, and no one, not even the spirits, could dictate his actions. Yet, as the months passed, the illness spread to the children. Fever, fatigue, and rashes began to appear in the youngest members of the village, and many began to die. Obinna's heart grew heavy with guilt, but his pride still held him back from doing what was right. He would not be swayed, not even by the pleas of his own people. The villagers grew more fearful, murmuring that the souls of the unburied wives were now seeking vengeance. Obinna's refusal to bury them had ignited something far darker than he could comprehend. Time passed, and Obinna's life continued in the same pattern. He married a third wife, Ifeoma, a woman from a neighboring village who carried with her a quiet strength. Her pregnancy was difficult, and Obinna could sense her discomfort. But even as she grew weaker, he continued to deny her the burial rites her ancestors had set forth. When she died in childbirth, a sadness overcame the village, but Obinna locked her away in the same chamber as the others, determined to protect the unborn child that had not yet taken a breath. The village now stood on the edge of ruin. Fields lay fallow, the once vibrant crops now dead and rotting in the ground. The villagers could feel the oppressive weight of something dark closing in. The village's only source of water had been poisoned by an unknown force, and the rivers had turned stagnant. Obinna's house, once a symbol of prosperity, now stood as an eerie reminder of the damage his refusal had wrought. He could feel the pressure mounting as his wealth began to dwindle. But Obinna remained steadfast, clinging to his belief that the spirits would eventually understand. An old man, the chief elder of the village, came to visit Obinna. His name was Okochukwu, and he had witnessed the rise and fall of many villages in his time. He had seen prosperity and ruin, and he had learned that there were forces beyond human comprehension. Okochukwu entered Obinna's home, sensing the dark presence that had settled there. The land cries out for the souls of the departed, he said softly, his voice shaking with the weight of ancient wisdom. The refusal to bury the dead is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of weakness. You defy the ancestors, and they will strike back. Obinna, still proud and defiant, responded, I have done no wrong. I have only tried to protect my family. But Okochukwu shook his head. Your actions have brought the wrath of the ancestors upon us all. The spirits of your wives are trapped in limbo, unable to rest. They grow restless, and their anger festers in the land. You must bury them if you wish to save your family and your people. Despite the elders' warning, Obinna's pride kept him from taking action. The sickness in the village worsened, claiming more lives each day. The crops failed, the animals continued to die, and the rivers became more polluted. The villagers began to lose hope, but the elders, now fearing for the survival of the village, gathered once more to seek the help of the spiritual leaders. It was clear now that the curse of the unburied souls was no mere superstition, it was real. Obinna's heart ached as he watched the village crumble around him. He had been too stubborn, too proud. He realized that the weight of his actions was too much for him to bear alone. But the guilt was overwhelming. Could he still undo the damage he had caused? Would the spirits of his wives ever forgive him? As Obinna sat in his home, deep in thought, a strange sensation gripped him. He could feel the presence of his wives, those whose bodies lay hidden in his house, unburied and restless. At night, he heard whispers and the faint sound of cries from the chambers where their bodies were kept. The wind would stir in unnatural ways, rattling the windows and doors as if trying to break free. But it was not just the whispers that unnerved him, it was the cold touch that seemed to linger in the air, the same coldness that had begun to seep into his heart. Obinna knew then that the curse was not just a village problem, it was personal. The souls of his wives were reaching out to him, their anger rising with each passing day. He could feel their frustration, their need for release. But Obinna still hesitated. Would burying them be enough to appease the spirits? Or would it only make things worse? The village, now on the brink of collapse, held a council meeting, and Obinna was summoned to stand before them. The elders, once respectful of his wealth and position, now regarded him with distrust and fear. The time has come for you to make a choice, the chief elder declared. You must either bury your wives and appease the spirits, or you must leave this village and live with the consequences of your actions. Obinna stood before the council, his heart heavy with guilt. He realized that the choices before him were stark. He could either admit his wrongdoings and face the wrath of his ancestors or leave the village to its fate. The weight of his decision threatened to crush him. Would he sacrifice his pride for the sake of the village and his family, or would he continue to refuse, sealing their fate? With the elder's words ringing in his ears, Obinna made his way to the chamber where his wives lay hidden. The decision had been made, he would bury them. As he opened the chest and gazed upon their lifeless forms, he was struck by the overwhelming sense of regret. His wives had trusted him, had given their lives for his legacy. And he had failed them. He began to prepare the bodies for burial, carefully wrapping them in cloth, just as tradition demanded. But as he began to dig their graves in the village's sacred burial ground, he noticed something strange. The earth seemed to resist him, as though it was unwilling to accept the dead. The deeper he dug, the harder the soil became, and the air grew thick with an unnatural heaviness. After much struggle, Obinna finally laid his wives to rest, burying them in the sacred ground with a prayer for their souls. As he filled in the last of the earth, a strange calm settled over him. The wind, which had been so fierce and restless, suddenly stilled. The air seemed to lighten, and the oppressive heaviness that had hung over the village began to dissipate. The next day, the villagers woke to find that the air felt fresher, the sun brighter, and the sickness that had plagued them seemed to ease. The crops that had withered in the fields began to show signs of new life. It seemed as though Obinna's act of burying his wives had lifted the curse, and the village began to heal. Though Obinna had finally buried his wives, the road to reconciliation with the villagers was not an easy one. Many had lost loved ones, their lives forever changed by the illness that had swept through the village. Obinna knew that his wealth and pride had cost them dearly. He began to offer his resources to rebuild the village, helping those who had lost their homes and livestock. As the months passed, Obinna's remorse turned to humility. He began to visit the elders and spiritual leaders, offering his apologies and seeking guidance on how to make amends. It was not an easy process, and some villagers remained wary of him. But in time, Obinna learned the importance of community, tradition, and respect for the spirits. The days following the burial were strangely peaceful, but Obinna knew the village's healing had only just begun. The sickness, though lessening, still lingered in some corners of the village, and many were still wary of the once proud merchant. To restore his standing, Obinna began to work side by side with the villagers, planting new crops and ensuring that the sacred lands were properly cared for. The elders, while cautious, observed his actions with quiet approval. The land was beginning to show signs of life again, but the spiritual unrest was not so easily quelled. Obinna had much more to do before he could earn true redemption. One afternoon, as Obinna walked in the fields, he saw a small child, his former neighbor's son, playing near the river. The child, who had survived the sickness, looked at him with wide, knowing eyes. The child's gaze lingered on Obinna's face, filled with both pity and understanding. For a moment, Obinna felt the weight of his past mistakes more than ever. It was not enough to walk the land or rebuild the village, he would need to rebuild his soul as well. Obinna's journey toward redemption brought him to the village shaman, a powerful woman named Afia, whose knowledge of the spiritual world surpassed even the elders. Afia had long been a guide to the village, her connection to the spirits undeniable. She greeted Obinna with a quiet wisdom that left him humbled. "You have buried your wives, Obinna," she said, her voice like the wind rustling through the trees, "but the spirits are still restless. The earth has accepted them, but you have not yet accepted yourself." Her words cut through him like a knife, but he listened intently as she spoke of the need for spiritual atonement. "You must seek forgiveness from the ancestors," she told him, "and only then would the land fully heal." Obinna knew she spoke the truth. His pride had caused far more than a curse, it had wounded the spirit of his village and the spirits of his wives. He left the shaman's hut with a new sense of purpose, determined to make amends in ways beyond the material. In the village, the ancestors were revered above all else. Each year, the villagers held a feast to honor those who had passed before them. Obinna, in his prideful youth, had always dismissed the importance of this ritual. But now, he saw it as a necessary step in his path to healing. With Afia's guidance, Obinna prepared a grand feast in honor of the ancestors. It was a moment of humility, a recognition of the powers beyond the material world that govern life and death. On the day of the feast, Obinna invited the villagers to join him in a sacred ceremony, where offerings of food, drink, and prayers would be made to the ancestors. The villagers, once skeptical, now saw the sincerity in Obinna's efforts. As the feast began, a strange quiet settled over the land, as though the earth itself was listening. The villagers prayed, asking for peace, for healing, and for forgiveness. That night, as the moon rose high, a powerful wind swept through the village, and Obinna felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The restless spirits seemed to retreat into the ether, their anger softened. The curse had not been fully lifted, but this was a beginning, a small but vital step forward. The river that had once been poisoned by Obinna's pride was now showing signs of life. The water, which had been thick and brown, was slowly becoming clearer. The villagers, who had been dependent on the river for fishing and irrigation, were amazed. They saw it as a sign that the land was finally beginning to heal. Obinna watched as the children once again played near the water's edge, their laughter echoing across the village. It was a sound he had not heard in many years. But Obinna knew that the healing of the river was only the first step. The land, the people, and the spirits would need time. His journey toward redemption would not be swift, but he was no longer the man he had once been. He had come to understand that true healing came not from wealth or power, but from humility and respect. As Obinna lay in bed one night, he was awoken by a strange, otherworldly presence. The room grew cold, and a faint glow illuminated the darkness. Obinna's heart raced as he saw the spirits of his wife standing before him. They were not angry or vengeful as he had feared. Instead, they looked at him with sad, but understanding eyes. "We have forgiven you, Obinna," they whispered in unison, their voices like the wind through the trees. "But you must forgive yourself. Only then will the land and the people find peace." The vision of his wife disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Obinna trembling. He knew that the spirits had truly forgiven him, but the question remained, could he forgive himself? With the land healing, the crops began to grow once again. The villagers, inspired by Obinna's newfound humility, worked together to rebuild their homes and their lives. The rivers were once again full of fish, and the fields were green with growing crops. Obinna did all he could to assist, often working alongside the others to restore the village. But this time, his wealth and status meant little. It was his actions, not his riches, that were truly valued. As Obinna worked, he began to realize that he had become a different man. He no longer viewed the village as a place to exploit for his own gain. Instead, he saw it as a community of people who had suffered and endured. And he, too, had suffered, but now he had the chance to make things right. Months passed, and Obinna's redemption continued to unfold. His family had begun to grow again, not just through the crops they planted, but through the relationships he built with the villagers. He now understood the importance of community, of shared suffering and shared joy. The once prosperous merchant was now a humble man who had lost much but had gained more than he could ever have imagined. As the village flourished, so did Obinna's sense of purpose. He began to work with the elders and spiritual leaders, ensuring that the customs and traditions of the village were upheld. He no longer saw himself as above the land or the people. He was, for the first time in his life, a true part of the community. After many years of sorrow, Obinna's household was blessed with a new pregnancy. This time, there was no fear. There was no arrogance, only hope. Obinna and his wife, Ngozi, awaited the child with joy and anticipation. The village rejoiced with them, knowing that this new life was a symbol of the village's rebirth, a sign that the curse had truly been lifted. As the child grew within Ngozi, Obinna made sure to honor the traditions that had once been so important to his ancestors. The entire village rallied around the couple, offering prayers and support. This child, unlike the others before, would not grow up under the shadow of death. He would grow up in a world that had been healed by humility and respect. Obinna had spent years making amends, but there was one final act left to complete, the burial of his first wife, Adoma. Though he had hidden her away for so long, he knew that this was the final step in his redemption. He dug a new grave in the sacred burial ground, surrounded by the community who had supported him through his transformation. As he laid Adoma to rest, he felt a weight lift from his chest. Finally, the land, the spirits, and his soul were at peace. The villagers gathered around the grave, offering prayers and tributes to the spirit of Adoma, whose life had been taken too soon. As the last of the earth was placed over her grave, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the village. Obinna stood there, humbled, knowing that he had done everything in his power to make things right. Years passed, and Obinna's transformation into a humble leader was complete. He no longer sought to amass wealth for himself, but rather to rebuild the community he had once torn apart. The villagers had come to love and respect him, not because of his riches, but because of his journey, his struggle, repentance, and atonement for his past mistakes. His house, once filled with luxurious goods, now stood as a simple abode, humble and welcoming to all. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Obinna sat outside his home, watching the children play near the river. He felt a deep peace in his heart. His soul had been healed, the land had been restored, and the people were thriving. He knew, however, that his time on this earth was drawing to a close. Though he had worked tirelessly for the community, there was a final chapter to be written, the passing of the man who had once been the village's greatest merchant, and who had become its greatest servant. Obinna lay in bed that night, surrounded by his family and the village elders. His heart was content, his mind at ease. As he drifted into a peaceful sleep, he passed from this world, not in fear or regret, but in quiet acceptance of the life he had lived. The village awoke to the news of Obinna's death with mixed emotions. Many had known him as the wealthy merchant who once commanded the village through his wealth and pride. But in the years before his passing, he had become a man they respected and loved, a man who had redeemed himself through his actions. Obinna's death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one, built on the lessons of humility, forgiveness, and community. The village mourned Obinna deeply. His funeral was held with great respect and ceremony, with people from all over the region coming to pay their respects. As his body was lowered into the ground, the villagers gathered around, offering prayers and honoring the man who had once caused so much pain, but who had, in the end, brought so much healing. As the days passed following Obinna's death, the villagers began to reflect on his life and legacy. Obinna's name became synonymous with redemption, a symbol of how pride and wealth could lead to destruction, but also how humility and repentance could bring restoration. The younger generations, who had only known the humble Obinna, looked to him as a model of what it meant to live a life of integrity and service to others. In the years that followed, Obinna's children, raised in a village that had been healed by his actions, carried on his legacy. They worked alongside the villagers, continuing the work he had started in rebuilding the community. They honored their father's memory not by clinging to the wealth he had once amassed, but by serving the people, just as he had done in his final years. With Obinna's passing, the village needed a new leader, someone to guide them forward into a new era of prosperity. The elders, who had witnessed Obinna's transformation, chose his eldest son, Chidi, to take up the mantle of leadership. Chidi, though young, had inherited his father's wisdom and humility. He was determined to lead the village with the same compassion and dedication that his father had shown in his final years. As Chidi assumed the role of village leader, he made it clear that his father's teachings would guide him. He sought to build a village where wealth was not measured by material possessions, but by the strength of the community and the well-being of the land. Under his leadership, the village flourished, and the wounds of the past began to fade. The land, once scarred by the curse of the unburied souls, had fully recovered. The crops were bountiful, the rivers flowed with clean water, and the air was thick with life. The village had become a beacon of hope for other communities, a symbol of what could be achieved through humility, repentance, and unity. Chidi and the villagers worked together to maintain the harmony that Obinna had left behind. The younger generations were taught the importance of respecting the traditions and the spirits of the land. They learned from their elders about the dangers of pride and the importance of living in balance with nature. Obinna's legacy had not only saved the village but had also transformed it into a place of peace, prosperity, and respect for the forces that govern the earth. Afia, the village shaman, had played a key role in guiding Obinna toward his redemption. In the years following his death, she continued to provide wisdom and spiritual guidance to the village. Her connection to the spirits was deep, and she reminded the people of the importance of maintaining harmony with their ancestors. As she grew older, Afia passed on her knowledge to the younger generation of spiritual leaders, ensuring that the teachings of the past would not be lost. She spoke often of Obinna's journey, teaching the youth about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of humility in all things. Every year, the village held a festival to honor the ancestors and celebrate the renewal of the land. This festival had once been a somber occasion, marked by grief and fear of the spirits. But in the years following Obinna's redemption, the festival became a time of joy and gratitude. It was a time for the villagers to come together and celebrate the blessings they had received, blessings that had been earned through hard work, humility, and unity. At the heart of the festival was the ritual of remembrance, where the villagers would offer prayers to their ancestors and pay tribute to those who had passed. Obinna, though no longer physically present, was honored as a hero, a man who had saved the village with his sacrifice and transformation. Obinna's death had marked the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of healing for the community. The wounds that had once torn the village apart were slowly but surely being healed. The village was thriving, and the people had learned the importance of working together to overcome adversity. The younger generations, who had grown up in a village transformed by their parents' efforts, had learned the importance of humility, community, and respect for the earth. They understood that prosperity came not from wealth alone, but from the strength of the bonds they shared with one another and with the land. Years passed, and the village of Abalu became known as a place of peace and prosperity. The land remained fertile, the rivers flowed with clean water, and the village was free from the curses that had once plagued it. Obinna's legacy lived on, not in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the values he had instilled in the community. As the years went by, the story of Obinna's redemption became a legend, a tale passed down from generation to generation. It was a reminder of the dangers of pride, the importance of humility, and the power of forgiveness. The village had been forever changed by Obinna's journey, and the lessons learned from his life would guide the people for generations to come. As the village continued to prosper, a new tradition emerged, one that honored not only the ancestors but also the lessons of the past. Every year, the people of Abalu would gather to remember Obinna's journey. They would gather at the sacred burial ground where his wives lay to rest, offering prayers and tributes. It was said that the spirit of Obinna still watched over the village, guiding them with his wisdom. The people would gather and speak of his life, remembering the man who had once been their greatest merchant, but who had become their greatest servant. The village of Abalu had been transformed by his journey, and the spirit of redemption would live on in the hearts of its people forever.